Step away from the dog. Pippa Connell said it before she even thought about what she was saying. She was standing behind the counter of Connell & Co. Books, half buried in a stack of overdue inventory, when the door had blown open and something very large and very black had barreled past the spinning display of local poetry collections, knocked over a ceramic mug shaped like a bear and crawled. Yes, crawled. Beneath the table that held the discounted nature guides, the something turned out to be a dog. A Belgian Malinois the size of a small horse, wearing a collar that probably cost more than Pippa's monthly rent. 3 men in dark coats followed 30 seconds later. "Step away from the dog," Pippa repeated, planting herself between the men and the display table. She was 5'4", and the kind of soft that people described as warm, meaning she was round in the ways that made winters look less threatening, and strangers feel less afraid. None of that made her feel particularly intimidating right now. But the dog was under her table, and he was shaking, and that mattered more than what she felt. The largest man took a step forward. Pippa didn't move. Then a 4th person walked through the door, and the 3 men stopped immediately, straightening like they'd been called to attention. He was tall, dark-haired, and dressed like someone who had never once had to read a price tag in his life. He had the kind of face that made you certain he'd never been told no by anyone. Sharp jaw, dark eyes that moved across the room and catalogued everything in it within 2 seconds. A tattoo was visible just above his collar on the right side of his neck. Pippa would learn his name in about 40 seconds. She already did not trust him. "Where is he?" the man said, not a question. "Under the table." She didn't gesture. "Don't go closer." The man looked at her the way people look at objects that have spoken unexpectedly. "That is my dog." "I understand that." "Then step aside." "I will, once he's ready." A pause fell over the shop that Pippa could only describe as expensive. Even the dust in the air seemed to stop moving. The man studied her, then slowly, "My name is Nico Ferrante." She knew the name. Everyone in Halifax who paid even passing attention to the harbour district knew the name. Ferrante controlled 3 shipping companies, 2 hotels, a construction firm, and, if the rumours that floated through the waterfront bars were even partially accurate, considerably more than that. He was the kind of man who appeared at charity galas and sat at the best table and never seemed to need anything from anyone. His dog was currently wedged under a discount table in her bookshop, panting against the baseboard heater, surrounded by marked-down atlases. "Pippa Connell," she said, "this is my shop, and I'm asking you to give him 30 seconds. Ferrante looked at the table. "Vesper." The dog's ears moved. He didn't come out. "Vesper." Firmer this time, the command of someone who had never once had a command ignored. Vesper pressed himself flatter against the floor. One of the men shifted. Ferrante's jaw tightened, just slightly, just enough that Pippa caught it, and she realized something. He wasn't angry. He was concerned, and he didn't know what to do with that. "He's not being difficult," she said, keeping her voice even. "He's overloaded. He's been running. There's traffic noise from the street. 3 men rushed in after him. To him, that's 3 threats and a pursuit and nowhere safe to land." She glanced at the men behind him. Could they wait outside? Nobody moved. She remembered that they weren't waiting for her. Ferrante made a small gesture. All 3 men went out without a word. "And you," Pippa said. He raised an eyebrow. "You can stay, but further back, and no commands." For a moment, she genuinely believed he was going to simply ignore her. He was the kind of man who could have walked to that table and dragged his dog out by the collar, and there would have been nothing she could have done about it. But he didn't. He took 2 measured steps backward and said nothing. Pippa crouched down beside the table. She didn't grab at Vesper. She didn't call him, or clap her hands, or make any of the bright, encouraging sounds that usually made anxious animals feel worse. She set her hand flat on the floor about a foot from his nose and waited. Vesper stared at it. "Nobody needs anything from you right now," she said quietly. "Take your time." The shop was very still. Outside, a streetcar rang. The radiator knocked twice. Vesper sniffed her hand. She didn't move. He sniffed again. Then, after what felt like a full minute, his breathing slowed. The rigid tension in his hindquarters released. He crawled 1 inch forward and let his big head rest on top of her hand. Pippa looked over at Ferrante. He was watching with an expression that was very carefully not showing what it was. "He can come to you on his own now," she said, "if you just wait." Ferrante didn't answer. He crouched, right there in his expensive suit, on the floor of her shop, and waited. Vesper lifted his head. He looked at Pippa. He looked at Ferrante. Then he stood, shook himself, and walked directly to Ferrante, who pressed one hand firm and sure along the dog's neck. Vesper leaned all his weight into him. Instantly, no hesitation. Pippa saw Ferrante understand something in that moment, that there had been no rejection in what the dog had done. Just a creature that had needed something different, and a person who hadn't yet known how to give it. "What exactly did you do?" Ferrante said, looking at her across Vesper's broad back. "Nothing remarkable. You refused 4 of my men and told me to wait. I told your dog to take his time." He studied her. She had the distinct impression of being assessed in a way that very few people survived without changing how they presented themselves. She didn't change anything. "Thank you," he said. It sounded like it cost him something small but real. "You're welcome," she said. "Please don't let him run past traffic again." He left. She assumed that was the end of it. She was completely wrong. 3 days later, Ferrante came back. Vesper was with him, leash on, perfectly calm. Pippa was reorganizing the Canadian fiction section when the bell above the door rang. Vesper's tail moved when he saw her. Ferrante's expression didn't. "He won't settle at night," Ferrante said. Pippa looked at Vesper. The dog appeared entirely at ease, investigating a low shelf of travel writing with dignified interest. "He looks settled to me. At home, he won't settle at home." Pippa folded her arms. "What does his routine look like?" Ferrante described it: scheduled exercises, structured patrol of the property, positioned rest during meetings, accompaniment on all transfers. Vesper worked from early morning until late evening, every day. Pippa absorbed this. When does he get to be a dog? He is a dog. When does he get to do something pointless? Run for no reason? Sniff something thoroughly for 8 minutes just because it's interesting? Ferrante frowned. That sounds inefficient. Something settled into place for Pippa. "I think I understand the problem." She helped, quietly, practically. Vesper was welcome in the shop whenever Ferrante brought him. She introduced him to the 2 regulars who came in every Saturday, and who turned out to be exactly the kind of unhurried, low-energy company that a dog recovering from perpetual alertness needed. She let him nap behind the counter, and she did not ask him to perform anything. Ferrante always had a reason to be there. Vesper needed the social exposure. Vesper had been pulling toward this street on walks. Vesper had shown an unexpected interest in the front display window. The reasons became thinner with each visit. Pippa started keeping track. By the 4th visit, Vesper was sprawled behind the returns desk with a stolen coffee table book about the Canadian Rockies between his paws. And Ferrante was standing near the philosophy shelves with his phone in his hand, not making any calls. "You could sit," Pippa offered. "I'm fine. There's a chair. I see it." She let him stand, but she noticed that he had positioned himself where he could see both the front door and the reflection in the tall window on the east wall. tracking every person who walked past outside, monitoring movement with an ease that suggested he'd never learned to stop doing it. By the 6th visit, she noticed Vesper had changed. When the dog first started coming into the shop, he had rested in a way that was still somehow watchful. His ears tracked every sound, his eyes followed every customer. Even in stillness, some part of him had remained online, waiting for instruction. Now he slept, actually slept. Ribs rising and falling, jaw slack, completely unconscious on the mat she'd put behind the counter. She glanced at Ferrante, who was watching the dog with an expression that was something between puzzled and grateful. "He looks different," Ferrante said. "He's learning that he's allowed to stop." A pause. "Do you think he's happy?" She considered the question seriously, because it deserved a serious answer. "I think he's figuring out what that means." Ferrante looked back at the dog. Pipa looked at Ferrante. He was standing the same way he always stood, back to the wall, sight-line to the door, phone in his coat pocket with his hand near it. Even now, in a bookshop on a Thursday afternoon with his dog asleep 3 feet away, he was still at work, still scanning, still waiting for the threat that never quite materialized. She picked up a paperback that had been sitting on the corner of the counter and held it out to him. He looked at it. "What is this?" "It's a novel." "I can see that." "Sit down and read 3 pages." He stared at her. She held the book steady. Ferrante took the book. He sat in the chair she'd offered. He read 3 pages, then 6. Vesper snored. Pippa went back to cataloguing returns. When she looked up 20 minutes later, he was still reading. He didn't know she'd noticed, and she didn't say anything. It was her friend and part-time book supplier, Ross Wakefield, who arrived one afternoon, carrying 2 cups of tea from the shop, around the corner, walking in the way people walk into a place they've always been comfortable in. Vesper went to him immediately. Ross crouched and gave the dog a thorough scratch behind both ears with the ease of someone who'd always known exactly how to do that. "Good boy," Ross said. Vesper agreed wholeheartedly. Ferrante, who had been standing at the new arrival's table, watched the entire exchange without expression. Pippa took one of the teas. "Thanks. You'd forget to drink anything otherwise." Ross straightened. "Crackers again?" "I had crackers and cheese this time." "That's evidence that cheese exists near crackers, not a meal." Ferrante's eyes moved between the two of them, with the careful attention of someone doing arithmetic. Ross left 20 minutes later, after going through a box of incoming stock with Pippa in the back room. Ferrante remained. He was quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. "How long have you known him?" he said eventually. Pippa didn't look up from her inventory sheet. "Ross? About 5 years." "He brings you tea often?" "Sometimes." "Does he do that for all his suppliers?" She looked up. Ferrante was examining the spine of a book he clearly had no interest in. "No," she said simply. That answer made things worse, which she had expected. She let him work through it for a few more minutes before explaining, without being asked again, that Ross was a friend and professional acquaintance, that his tea-bringing habit was not exclusive, and that there was nothing further to infer. She chose not to mention that Ross had once, 2 years ago, asked her to dinner, and she'd said no, because it felt like an unnecessary complication, and because Ferrante, who had no business caring about any of this, was already doing a very poor job of looking indifferent. 2 days later, Ferrante arrived carrying lunch. He carried it himself. That was what surprised her most. There were 2 bags from a waterfront restaurant with a 6-week reservation wait, and the food inside was very good and very excessive for a Tuesday afternoon in a bookshop. "This is too much food," Pippa said. "It's lunch. For 6 people," thought 2. She opened one container. The smell was genuinely extraordinary. She looked at Ferrante, who was now studying the local history section with profound focus. Is this because Ross brought tea? No. That was fast. The answer was fast because the answer is no. Vesper looked up from behind the counter, looked at Ferrante, and then rested his chin back on his paws, with the resigned expression of someone who had heard this kind of argument before. Your dog doesn't believe you, Pippa said. He's projecting. She served them both some of the food. Ferrante sat in the chair near the window, the chair with the slightly loose armrest that nobody else had ever sat in long enough to make feel claimed. They ate without making it a production. He came back the following week, and the week after that, Vesper investigated the back shelves and eventually fell asleep on a returned atlas of provincial parks. Ferrante answered emails. Pippa helped customers and had a long conversation about seed catalogues with a Tuesday regular and completely forgot that she was supposed to find any of this strange. The Literacy Foundation's spring fundraiser was the kind of event Pippa attended because Connell & Co. had donated books and volunteer reading time to their children's program for 3 years running, and the invitation recognized that. She wore the one dress she owned that felt like it belonged at something called a gala. She arrived on her own and immediately felt the particular loneliness of walking into a room where she didn't know how to stand. Ferrante was already there. His name was on a wall panel of major donors. Of course it was. She was introduced over the course of the next hour to more people than she could track. Most of them were pleasant. One of them, a woman named Constance Aldridge, polished in the way that suggested a great deal of time had been spent on appearing effortless, was less pleasant. "You're the woman who manages Nico's dog," Constance said the first time. "I own a bookshop," Pippa replied. The second time, when Constance introduced her to another donor, "This is Pippa. She's been so wonderful with Nico's dog." The third time, in a small cluster of foundation supporters, Constance's voice was light and pleasant and surgical. Pippa found the most creative approach to networking, really. Win over the right dog, and the doors just open themselves. There was laughter, gentle, social laughter, the kind that carried exactly the weight it intended to. Pippa felt heat rise from her sternum upward. She was aware of how the room probably saw her, the soft woman in the nice-enough dress, standing near Ferrante, having wandered into his orbit through the side entrance of a lucky coincidence. A convenient story. She had spent 3 years building a business that survived because of her own stubbornness and care, and ability to show up 7 days a week when necessary. That story had just been folded into something smaller and more useful for people who preferred their hierarchies tidy. She looked at Constance. "Vesper wandered into my shop," she said, keeping her voice entirely level. "Connell & Co. Books has donated over 2,000 hours of programming to this foundation's literacy initiatives. That's why I'm here tonight." She paused one beat. Neither the dog nor his owner had anything to do with that. The laughter stopped. She turned away. Behind her, she heard Ferrante's voice, low and clear, directed at the Foundation's events coordinator. "When you introduce the community partners later, introduce her correctly." Nothing about his tone was threatening. He simply said it the way he said everything. Like the outcome was not in question. When the community partners were acknowledged near the end of the evening, Pippa heard her name and her business, and 3 years of work spoken aloud in front of 200 people who now understood exactly why she belonged in that room. She found Ferrante afterward, standing near the windows at the edge of the crowd. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did. I handled the introduction." "I know." He said it without qualification. "I addressed something different." She studied him. He had waited. That was what she'd realized watching it happen. He had waited until she'd spoken for herself. Then he had made sure the record was accurate. He hadn't invented anything on her behalf. He had only refused to let something true be erased. "You could have embarrassed her," Pippa said. "I thought about it. And you chose the boring option." Something shifted in his expression, the effective one. She laughed despite herself. Then his face settled into something more serious. "She tried to make your work look accidental," he said. "It happens. It shouldn't." The simplicity of it caught her off guard. No performance, no grand declaration. Just a statement that treated the thing as obvious. But the evening had also shown her something she had been avoiding looking at directly. His name changed how rooms moved. His presence shifted the air in a way that radiated outward and reflected back onto everything near him, including her. She had spent 3 years making a business that was entirely and unambiguously hers. Standing next to Ferrante, she had felt the edges of that ownership getting soft. He could correct one room. He couldn't correct every room, and there would always be more rooms. She went home and thought about it for a long time. The following week, Vesper was asleep behind the counter when Pippa said what she'd been turning over for days. "He doesn't need to keep coming here." Ferrante looked up from the book he'd been reading, the 4th one he'd taken from her shelves since she'd first handed him a paperback and told him to sit down. "He's asleep. I mean regularly." She kept her voice even. "He's better. He's calmer. He's socializing. He's getting time where nobody asks anything of him. Whatever was happening when he first came in, it's not happening anymore." The room became very still. "So there's no professional reason," Ferrante said. "No." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he closed the book, set it on the counter, and called Vesper. The dog stood, walked reluctantly from behind the returns desk, then looked back at Pippa with an expression she could only describe as reproachful. "You're fine," she told him quietly. "You're doing really well." Ferrante walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on it, briefly. He didn't say anything. She didn't offer him anything to say. He left. He didn't come back the next day, or the day after. A week passed, then another, and Connell & Co. returned to what it had always been. Her shop, her schedule, her customers, her quiet. She hated it. Not the shop. She loved the shop, had always loved it. But she missed Vesper wedged into the corner, with his chin resting on someone's abandoned memoir. She missed finding a chewed corner on the nature guides and knowing exactly who was responsible. She missed the weight of Ferrante, occupying the chair near the window. The chair that nobody else had ever used because it sat at an odd angle, and the armrest was slightly loose, and somehow he was the only person who had ever sat in it long enough to make it feel claimed. She missed the particular silence of being in a room with someone who didn't need her to fill it. She had wanted distance to prove that her life was still hers. Now she had it. Her business was unchanged. Her routines were intact. Nobody introduced her in relation to anyone else. Nothing had been taken from her. Something was missing anyway. Across the city, Ferrante had a different problem. Vesper was fine. That was the problem. He ate. He exercised. He slept through the night for the first time in what his staff estimated was well over a year. He was calm in a way that the trainers described as remarkable and that Ferrante could only describe as the absence of something he had grown accustomed to monitoring. His dog didn't need Pippa Connell anymore, which meant Ferrante had to look at what was actually left. He had gone to the bookshop the first time because of Vesper. He had gone back because there were things still to observe. Then Vesper had improved further, and he had stayed anyway, and he had told himself each time that he was there because of the dog. He had learned her order at the tea shop around the corner. He had noticed when she changed the arrangement of the front display. He had carried lunch from a restaurant with a 6-week reservation wait because another man had shown up with tea. He had read 4 novels in a chair with a loose armrest. He had remembered which stories made her laugh before she made the sound. He had become, without intending to, a person who noticed small things about someone else and filed them away without knowing what he planned to do with them. His dog had stopped needing an excuse weeks before Ferrante had been willing to admit it. 3 weeks after he'd last walked through the door of Connell & Co., Ferrante went back. The bell rang. Pippa looked up from behind the counter. Her eyes moved automatically to the space behind him. Where's Vesper? At home. A pause. Is something wrong? No. He's eating? Yes. Sleeping? Yes. She waited. Ferrante stood in the middle of a bookshop that smelled like paper and radiator heat and the specific loose-leaf tea she bought from the market, 2 blocks over. He had come alone, with no dog at his side, no pretense in his hands, nothing to retrieve or justify his presence. For possibly the first time in a decade, Nico Ferrante had walked into a room with nothing prepared. "Then why are you here?" Pippa said. The silence stretched. He had managed 3 international shipping negotiations, the reorganization of 2 companies, and a number of conversations he preferred not to think about in detail. None of them had required this particular sentence. "I wanted to see you." She looked at him. "I spent 2 weeks trying to find a more complicated reason," he said. "There isn't one." The corner of her mouth moved. "So this has nothing to do with Vesper?" "No." "You're certain?" Because he could suddenly develop a very serious problem with. "Pippa." She let him find the silence. Then, "What exactly do you want?" He understood what she was doing. There was no dog between them. No professional context, no room for ambiguity. He had walked through her door once to collect something that belonged to him. Everything after that had been his own doing, even when he had pretended otherwise. "I'd like to take you to dinner," he said. She raised an eyebrow. That was a statement. He held her gaze. She waited. He had spent 30 years in rooms where people answered before he finished asking. She was giving him no such courtesy. "Pippa Connell." His voice changed, lower, stripped of its usual authority, careful in a way that was new. "Would you have dinner with me?" "Yes," she said. Something in his shoulders eased, very slightly, in a way she suspected he wasn't aware of. She was aware of it. For the first time since Vesper had barreled through her door and upended the ordinary logic of her Tuesdays, Nico Ferrante had come in without anything to hide behind. He had not come to retrieve or manage or explain. He had simply come because there was a woman on the other side of that door, and he had finally run out of reasons not to say so. Several months later, the bell above the door of Connell & Co. rang on a Saturday morning, and Vesper came in first, his nails clicking on the worn wood floor, and walked directly to Pippa without a sideways glance at the man holding the other end of the leash. Some things had changed. Ferrante and Pippa were together now, carefully, on terms they had built themselves, without anyone else's input. Some things had not changed at all. The shop was still hers. Same shelves, same regulars, same Tuesday visits from the woman who wanted to discuss seed catalogues. Ferrante had never once suggested changing anything about it, which she had noted and did not take for granted. Vesper settled behind the counter and rested his head in Pippa's lap, with the satisfied gravity of someone arriving exactly where he'd planned to be all along. Ferrante looked at him. Not even a hesitation. "This is how we met," Pippa said. "You told me to wait. You did. Your first words to me were step away from the dog. And your first words to me were stand aside." He considered this. Mine were worse. Significantly. Ferrante looked at Vesper, then at her, then back at the dog who had once obeyed him with the precision of a trained instrument, and now stole books and slept on his back and chose, every single time, to walk directly past the most powerful man in the Halifax Harbour district in order to sit on Pippa Connell's foot. The bell rang again. Ross Wakefield came in carrying 2 cups of tea, stopped to greet Vesper, and Vesper stood and wagged with the enthusiasm of someone who had always had plenty of loyalty to distribute. Ferrante's expression shifted. Pippa pointed at him. "Don't. I haven't said anything. You were thinking extremely loudly." He turned to look at her. She smiled. He almost did. Then his eyes moved to the 2 cups. "Why does he have 2? Pippa laughed. The kind that started deep and came out fully, without any attempt at restraint, filling the small, warm space of the shop from the returns desk to the spinning poetry display. Ferrante maintained with complete composure that it was a reasonable question. Vesper, having greeted everyone who mattered, returned to Pippa and pressed the full weight of his enormous head against her knee. Ferrante watched them. The first time Vesper had chosen her, he had thought something had broken. His trained dog, his reliable dog, the creature that had never in 3 years questioned a single command. He had thought control had failed. Nothing had failed. Vesper had simply understood something first and had done the only reasonable thing available to him. Walked toward it, sat down, and waited patiently for the rest of the world to catch up. Pippa had never tried to make Vesper into something different. She had only given him a place where nothing was expected of him, where he could stop being what he was trained to be long enough to discover what he actually was beneath it. Without meaning to, without ever trying, she had done the same for Ferrante. He had come back the first time because of his dog, then because his dog wanted to be there. Eventually, the dog had become the best door he had ever walked through, the most honest excuse he had ever made. And the first genuinely true thing he had done in years had been walking through that same door with nothing in his hands and no reason prepared. Vesper had chosen Pippa first. Ferrante had simply needed longer to understand that the dog, as it turned out, had been choosing for both of them.